Mockery echoed through the hospital cafeteria, aimed squarely at the quiet trauma nurse, picking at her cold lunch. 5 minutes later, shatterproof glass exploded inward. Heavily armed operators swarmed the room, lasers painting the arrogant doctors before their commander, locked eyes with the lonely nurse, and snapped a salute. The fluorescent lights of Seattle's Harborview Medical Center cast a sterile, unforgiving glow over the emergency department. It was Friday afternoon, a notorious time for the trauma bays, and the air already smelled sharp with antiseptic sweat and the metallic tang of blood. Amidst the chaotic symphony of blaring monitors and shouting residents, Ilara Bowman moved like a ghost. Ilara was 34, with tired green eyes and hair pulled back into a severe utilitarian bun. On paper, she was a Level 1 trauma nurse, a recent transfer who kept her head down, rarely spoke during staff meetings, and never joined the post-shift drinks at the local bar. She wore standard-issue grey scrubs that hid her athletic build, and she always wore long sleeves beneath them, regardless of the sweltering laundry room heat. To the elite surgical residents of Harborview, Ilara was nobody, a glorified chart pusher. "Clamp that bleeder now, I can't see a damn thing," yelled Dr. Richard Lawson. Lawson was the chief surgical resident, a man whose ego was matched only by the price tag of his sports car in the doctor's parking lot. He was currently standing over a 30-year-old victim of a horrific multi-car pileup on Interstate 5. The patient's blood pressure was tanking the monitor, screaming a rapid, high-pitched warning. "His chest is filling with air, Dr. Lawson," Ilara said, her voice eerily calm as she stood on the opposite side of the gurney. "Tension, pneumothorax. He needs decompression." "I know what he needs. Nurse—" Lawson snapped, sweat beading on his forehead as his hands slipped on the bloody trauma shears. "Get me a chest tube tray, and get out of my way." "We don't have time for a tube tray," Ilara stated, her tone flat. She didn't wait for his permission. In a blur of motion that defied the typical frantic energy of an ER, Ilara reached over the sterile field. She had a 14-gauge needle in her hand before Lawson even registered her movement. With surgical terrifying precision, she found the second intercostal space on the patient's mid-clavicular line and drove the needle into his chest. A sharp hiss of escaping trapped air filled the bay. Almost instantly, the erratic screaming of the heart monitor leveled out into a steady rhythmic beep. The patient's oxygen saturation began to climb. Lawson froze his face, flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. For a second, there was total silence in Trauma Bay, 3 save for the rhythmic pumping of the ventilator. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Lawson hissed, stepping into Ilara's personal space. "You are a nurse. You do not perform invasive procedures without my explicit authorization. If you ever overstep a physician again, Bowman, I will have your license pulled so fast you'll be emptying bedpans at a nursing home by Tuesday." Ilara didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him with an icy, hollow stare that made Lawson instinctively take a half-step back. It was a look forged in places Lawson couldn't even point to on a map. "Patient is stabilized, Doctor," Ilara said quietly. She stripped off her bloody gloves, tossed them in the biohazard bin, and walked out of the bay. 2 hours later, the adrenaline of the ER had settled into the slow, grinding fatigue of the mid-shift lull. Ilara purchased a plastic-wrapped turkey sandwich and a black coffee from the cafeteria, making her way to her usual spot, a small, isolated table in the far corner, facing the doors. She always faced the doors. Across the room, bathed in the natural light of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the helipad, sat the cool table. Dr. Lawson held court, surrounded by a few junior residents, and Kelly Preston, the notoriously gossipy charge nurse. I'm telling you the woman is a liability, Lawson was saying loudly, not caring if his voice carried over the clatter of plastic trays. He gestured animatedly with his fork. She actually shoved me out of the way. Thinks she's some kind of maverick because she got lucky with a needle decomp. Kelly laughed, a sharp, grating sound. Ilara. Oh, please. Have you seen her? She's like a robot. I asked her last week what she did before she came to Harborview, and she just stared at me. Total weirdo. Probably got fired from her last hospital for being creepy. Look at her, Lawson sneered, glancing over his shoulder. Eating alone. Again. Not a friend in the world. I bet she goes home to a dozen cats and a microwave dinner. Ilara heard every word. She took a slow sip of her bitter coffee, her expression unchanging. She didn't care about Lawson's fragile ego, and she certainly didn't care about Kelly's high school mean girl routine. Her mind was 7,000 miles away, drifting back to the dust-choked mountains of the Korangal Valley. She remembered the smell of cordite, the deafening roar of 10 warthogs doing gun runs, and the desperate, bloody triage of American operators whose lives depended entirely on her hands. She looked down at her left wrist. Beneath the sleeve of her scrub top rested a heavy, rugged Garmin Tactics smartwatch, a piece of gear heavily favored by Special Operations Forces. Beside it, barely visible, was a jagged scar that wrapped around her forearm, a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel in Syria. Just keep your head down, Major, she told herself. This is a civilian assignment, a cooling-off period. Let the kids play doctor. Ilara was not just a nurse. She was Major Ilara Bowman, a highly decorated trauma surgeon and Special Tactics medical officer, attached to the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. For the last 8 years she had deployed alongside Tier 1 units Delta Force DevGru and classified task forces that didn't officially exist. 6 months ago, a mission in Yemen had gone catastrophically wrong. Ilara had spent 48 hours trapped behind enemy lines, keeping 3 critically wounded operators alive with nothing but a blown-out medical kit and pure willpower. Command had forced her onto mandatory stateside leave. To keep her sharp, and to keep her from going insane with boredom, her commanding officer, General Clayton, had pulled some strings. He embedded her at Harborview, under a quiet cover, as a standard floor nurse, contracting through a discreet medical staffing subsidiary owned by the private defense firm Constellis. "Hey, Bowman," Lawson called out, suddenly emboldened by the laughter of his peers. He raised his voice so the whole cafeteria could hear. "If you're done playing hero in my ER, maybe you can run down to the basement and organize the supply closet. Fits your skill set a bit better, don't you think?" A smattering of snickers erupted from the nearby tables. Ilara slowly lowered her sandwich. She didn't look angry. She looked terribly, profoundly bored. She checked her watch. 1:14 p.m. Her shift was halfway over. She just had to survive the civilians for a few more hours. But as she raised her coffee cup back to her lips, the heavy Garmin watch on her wrist suddenly vibrated. It wasn't a standard text notification. The screen flared a bright, solid red. A single alphanumeric code flashed across the display, Crucible Actual. Code Black. Ilara's blood ran cold. The coffee cup stopped inches from her mouth. Code Black wasn't a hospital code. It was a JSOC emergency broadcast. It meant a catastrophic compromise. It meant a Tier 1 team was in critical danger, and standard extraction protocols had failed. Before Ilara could even stand up, the atmosphere in the cafeteria shifted violently. It started as a low, deep vibration, a heavy, rhythmic thumping that rattled the lukewarm coffee in Ilara's cup and made the plastic trays vibrate against the tables. The sound grew louder, dropping an oppressive blanket of noise over the room. "What is that?" Kelly asked, her smile faltering as she looked toward the massive windows. Life flight. Life flight doesn't sound like that. Lawson frowned, standing up from his chair. He was right. Standard civilian medevac helicopters had a high-pitched, whining rotor chop. This was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the hospital. Suddenly, a massive shadow blocked out the afternoon sun. Outside the cafeteria windows, touching down aggressively on the reinforced hospital helipad, was not a bright orange and white life flight chopper. It was a heavily modified MH-60M Black Hawk, painted completely in radar-absorbent matte black. There were no hospital markings, no red crosses, only the faint stenciled emblem of the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. The downdraft was so violent, it ripped the decorative bushes from their planters outside and slammed debris against the reinforced cafeteria glass. Inside, panic erupted. Nurses screamed. Doctors dropped their food. Patients in wheelchairs were hastily pulled away from the windows by terrified staff. Lawson stumbled backward, tripping over his own chair and landing hard on the linoleum floor, his arrogant facade completely shattering into sheer terror. "Active shooter, get down! Everyone get down!" a security guard yelled, fumbling for his radio. Ilara didn't get down. She stood up, her posture instantly shifting from the slouched invisible nurse to a rigid, hyper-alert military officer. Her eyes locked onto the side doors of the Black Hawk as they slid open before the skids even hit the concrete. 4 men poured out of the bird. They weren't police. They weren't SWAT. They were massive figures clad in full battle rattle, Crye-Precision multicam uniforms, heavy plate carriers loaded with magazines, and suppressed HK-416 assault rifles gripped tight to their chests. 4-tube panoramic night vision goggles, GPNVG 18S, were flipped up on their high-cut ballistic helmets. Their faces were obscured by balaclavas and dark tactical glasses. They moved with a terrifying synchronized fluidity. They didn't run. They flowed toward the hospital's emergency fire doors that connected directly to the cafeteria. Crash! The heavy metal fire doors were kicked open with enough force to rip the hinges from the drywall. The operators breached the cafeteria, fanning out instantly, their weapon muzzles tracking the room with laser sights dancing across the terrified medical staff. "Nobody move, stay exactly where you are," the lead operator barked. His voice was a harsh, gravelly command, amplified by an electronic comms headset. The cafeteria plunged into absolute chaos. Kelly was sobbing under a table. Lawson was crawling backward on his hands and knees, holding his hands up in the air. "Please!" Lawson shrieked, his voice cracking. "I'm a surgeon. I'm the chief resident. Whatever you want, drugs, money, I can get it. Don't shoot." The point operator, a massive man with a subdued American flag patch on his shoulder, didn't even look at Lawson. He stepped forward, his heavy combat boots crunching over spilled food and dropped silverware, and shoved Lawson aside with the barrel of his rifle, like the doctor was nothing more than an annoying piece of furniture. "Clear the path," the operator growled. The hospital security guard, a retired beat cop named Gary, unholstered his 9mm revolver with trembling hands. "Halt! Drop your weapons." In the blink of an eye, 2 laser sights snapped directly onto Gary's chest. "Put it down, Gary." A calm, commanding female voice rang out over the screaming. Everyone froze. Lawson, trembling on the floor, looked up. Kelly stopped crying. The security guard blinked in confusion. It was Ilara. She stepped out from behind her corner table, her hands resting easily at her sides. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't running. She walked directly toward the heavily armed men who had just violently hijacked the hospital. "Nurse Bowman, are you insane?" Lawson hissed from the floor. "Get down." Ilara ignored him. She stopped 10 feet from the lead operator. The heavily armed men didn't raise their weapons at her. Instead, they immediately lowered the barrels of their rifles, pointing them at the floor. The lead operator reached up and pulled down his balaclava. It was Master Sergeant David Miller, a hardened Delta Force operator Ilara had patched up during a brutal firefight in Fallujah 3 years ago. His face was streaked with camouflage paint and sweat, his eyes wide with desperate urgency. To the absolute shock of every doctor, nurse, and patient in the room, the terrifying, heavily armed giant snapped his boots together and threw a sharp, perfect salute to the quiet trauma nurse. "Major Bowman." Miller's voice rang out clear and respectful, echoing in the dead silence of the cafeteria. Lawson's jaw practically hit the linoleum. "Major at ease, Master Sergeant." Ilara said, her voice completely stripped of its quiet, subservient hospital tone. It was hard, authoritative, and sharp as a scalpel. "What the hell is going on, Miller? You just broke 6 different federal laws, landing a saw bird on a civilian pad." "We don't have time, ma'am," Miller said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into a rapid, tactical cadence. "General Clayton authorized the breach. We have a Black Swan event. Ghost Actual's convoy was hit by an IED in a classified zone in Eastern Europe. He's critical. Shrapnel in the descending aorta, massive hemorrhaging. He's in the air right now, but the military surgeons at Ramstein are saying he won't make the flight." Ilara's eyes narrowed. Ghost Actual was the call sign for the commander of the most elite task force in the US arsenal, and he was one of her closest friends. "Where is he?" Ilara demanded. "Inbound on a C-17 flying supersonic. But they need a specialized trauma surgeon ready to operate the second he touches down at Andrews Air Force Base. General Clayton said there is only one surgeon on the planet who can pull off this bypass in a combat zone." Miller looked her dead in the eye. "We need you back in the game, Major. Right now." Ilara stood in silence for a fraction of a second. She looked back over her shoulder. She looked at Lawson, pathetic and terrified on the floor. She looked at the spilled turkey sandwich. The facade was over. The game of playing normal was done. Ilara reached to the back of her neck and unclipped her hospital ID badge. She tossed it onto the nearest table. "Get me a surgical kit and prep the bird," Ilara ordered, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made the surrounding doctors flinch. "We fly in 60 seconds. Deafening rotor wash swallowed her words the moment she stepped toward the helipad. Ilara didn't look back at the shattered emergency fire doors, nor did she spare a single glance for Dr. Richard Lawson, who was still clutching his knees on the cafeteria floor, pale and completely paralyzed by the reality check. He was a big fish in a tiny, sterile pond. Ilara had just been called back to the ocean. Master Sergeant Miller tossed a heavy Kevlar-lined flight helmet and a tactical headset into Ilara's hands the second she cleared the Black Hawk's doors. She strapped into the jump seat, sliding the headset over her ears, just as the MH-60M banked hard to the east, aggressively gaining altitude over the Seattle skyline. "Comms check, Major." Miller's voice crackled through the earpiece. "I have you 5 actual," Ilara replied instinctively, falling back into military protocol. "Give me the medical sitrep on Ghost, and don't sugarcoat it." Miller tapped a ruggedized Panasonic toughpad strapped to his thigh and mirrored the display to a small monitor bolted to the fuselage in front of Ilara. A live telemetry feed populated the screen, showing horrific vital signs. Heart rate 145 and thready. Blood pressure tanking at 60/40. "Ghost Actual is Colonel James Riley," Miller said grimly. "Convoy took a shaped charge, IED, right through the armored chassis of his Striker, outside a black site near the Ukrainian border. Shrapnel bypassed his side plates, entered the left lateral thorax, shattered 3 ribs and lodged dead center in the descending aorta." He's bleeding out into his chest cavity. The critical care air transport team on the C-17 managed to intubate and push whole blood, but they are losing the battle. Ilara stared at the telemetry. James Riley. He wasn't just a commander. He was the man who had pulled her out of the wreckage of a downed pavehawk in Kandahar 6 years ago, burning his own hands to the bone to free her from the twisted metal. "Patch me through to the C-17, Ilara ordered, her voice completely devoid of emotion. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. A moment later, the comms clicked. A frantic, breathless voice filled Ilara's ears over the deafening hum of the cargo plane's engines. "This is Staff Sergeant Jenkins, CCATT medic. We are losing him. I've pushed 4 units of O negative and his pressure is still dropping. Chest tube output is massive." "Jenkins, this is Major Bowman," Ilara said, her tone a deliberate, chilling contrast to the medic's panic. "Breathe. You have a catastrophic hemorrhagic leak. Pushing blood is just filling a bucket with a hole in it. You need to deploy a Reboa balloon right now, or he will code before you reach American airspace." "Major, I'm a flight medic, not a vascular surgeon," Jenkins stammered. "I don't have the clearance for an endovascular aortic occlusion." "I am giving you the clearance," Ilara barked. "Get a Zone 1 Reboa kit from the trauma bag. Access the common femoral artery using ultrasound guidance. Do it now, Jenkins. I will talk you through every millimeter." For the next 2 hours, the Black Hawk screamed across the sky toward a classified military airfield, eventually transferring Ilara to a supersonic F-15E Strike Eagle, modified with a passenger pod to cut the cross-country travel time in half. Throughout the grueling high-G flight, Ilara remained on the comms, a disembodied guardian angel, guiding a terrified 22-year-old medic through one of the most complex, high-risk temporizing procedures in trauma surgery. "Advance the catheter," Ilara instructed, her eyes squeezed shut against the G-force of the fighter jet, visualizing the anatomy in her mind. "Stop at 46 centimeters. Inflate the balloon with 8 ccs of saline. Clamp the line." A tortuous 10 seconds of radio silence followed. Balloon inflated. Jenkins finally gasped, sounding on the verge of tears. "Major, pressure is coming up. 90/60. Bleeding in the chest tube has slowed. We bought him some time." "Good work, Sergeant," Ilara said softly. "Keep him heavily sedated. I'll see you on the tarmac." By the time Ilara touched down at Joint Base, Andrews in Maryland, the sun had set, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and bruised orange. General Thomas Clayton was waiting on the tarmac, flanked by a fully prepped Mobile Forward Surgical Team, MFST. An armored surgical trailer, brightly lit and humming with generators, sat 50 yards from the runway. Major General Clayton nodded, handing her a pair of sterile surgical scrubs. He didn't ask how her vacation at Harborview was going. "The Globemaster is on final approach. You have 10 minutes to scrub in. We can't move him to Walter Reed. He won't survive the ambulance ride." "I don't need a hospital, General," Ilara said, ripping the civilian scrub top over her head and tossing it onto the tarmac. "I just need a scalpel and enough light to see the devil." Tires screeched against the concrete as the massive grey C-17 Globemaster slammed onto the runway, its thrust reversers roaring like a wounded beast. Before the aircraft had even come to a complete halt, the rear cargo ramp began to lower. Ilara ran up the ramp, flanked by 2 military surgical assistants, plunging into the cavernous, freezing belly of the cargo plane. The smell of jet fuel and copper immediately assaulted her senses. Colonel Riley was strapped to an aluminum NATO litter, surrounded by monitors, empty blood bags, and the exhausted, blood-soaked Staff Sergeant Jenkins. "Report," Ilara demanded, stepping into the makeshift sterile field. "Reboa is holding, but his lactic acid is through the roof." Tissue ischemia is setting in, Jenkins reported rapidly. If we don't restore blood flow to his lower extremities in the next 15 minutes, he loses his legs. If the balloon bursts, he loses his life. Scalpel, Ilara snapped, holding out her gloved hand. The military scrub nurse slapped a number 10 blade into her palm. Ilara didn't hesitate. She performed a rapid clamshell thoracotomy, slicing horizontally across Riley's chest and using heavy rib spreaders to crank his ribcage open. It was a brutal medieval-looking procedure, but it gave her total access to his thoracic cavity. "Suction, get this blood out of my way." Ilara ordered, her hands moving with blinding speed. The cavity was a war zone. The jagged piece of shrapnel, a twisted slab of tungsten, was pulsating rhythmically against the shredded wall of the aorta. It was acting like a plug. The moment Ilara moved it, Riley would bleed to death in seconds. "I need cross clamps and a Dacron tube graft," Ilara said, her voice dropping into a terrifyingly calm register. This was her element. Not the sterile political hallways of Harborview, but the bleeding edge of the abyss. "Jenkins, the second I clamp the aorta above the injury, you deflate that Reboa balloon." "Understood. Yes, ma'am." On 3, Ilara positioned the heavy steel clamps. 1, 2, 3, clamp deflate. Ilara clamped the massive vessel, effectively stopping blood flow to the lower half of Riley's body. She had exactly 8 minutes to rebuild the largest artery in the human body before irreversible organ failure set in. With surgical tweezers, she extracted the jagged shrapnel, dropping it into a metal kidney basin with a sharp clink. Blood immediately surged from the laceration, but the clamps held. Working with a speed that defied human anatomy, Ilara began to suture the synthetic Dacron graft to the torn edges of the aorta, her needle flashing under the harsh halogen lights of the cargo bay. "Pressure is dropping, Major," the anesthesiologist warned. "He can't handle the clamping much longer. Give him pressors. Keep his brain perfused." "I need 2 more minutes," Ilara muttered, tying microscopic knots with absolute precision. Sweat beaded on her forehead, but her hands were made of stone. Every suture was perfect, every movement calculated to the millimeter. Finally, she tied the last surgical knot. Removing clamps, re-establishing flow, Ilara announced. She slowly released the proximal cross-clamp. The room held its collective breath. The synthetic graft expanded, turning deep red as Riley's blood rushed through the newly rebuilt pipeline. Ilara stared at the suture lines, looking for any sign of a leak. Nothing. It was completely watertight. "Vitals?" Ilara asked, stepping back from the table. The anesthesiologist let out a long, shuddering exhale. "Pressure is rebounding. 110/70. Heart rate is stabilizing at 90. Pulse oximetry is climbing." "Major, you got him." A collective wave of relief washed over the CCATT team. Staff Sergeant Jenkins slumped back against the fuselage, staring at Ilara with a mixture of utter shock and profound reverence. Ilara simply stripped off her bloody gloves. "Good work, team. Pack him up. Get him transported to the surgical ICU at Walter Reed for closure and recovery." 2 hours later, Ilara walked out of the mobile command center on the tarmac. The cool Maryland night air felt incredible against her skin. General Clayton was leaning against the hood of a black SUV, smoking a cigar. He held out a silver hip flask as she approached. "To Harborview's loss," Clayton said, a wry smile touching his lips. Ilara took the flask, unscrewed the cap, and took a long burn of bourbon. "That civilian rotation was a mistake, General. I belong out here." "I know," Clayton replied, looking up at the stars. "The President was briefed on Riley's survival. Your cooling-off period is officially terminated, Major. Delta wants you back on active rotation by Monday." Ilara looked down at her Garmin watch. The screen was black, quiet, and peaceful. She thought about Dr. Lawson Kelly, the charge nurse, and the petty squabbles of the civilian ER. They seemed like a lifetime ago. "I'll be ready, sir," Ilara said, handing the flask back. She wasn't the invisible nurse eating alone in the corner. She was the ghost in the machine, the last line of defense for the deadliest men on Earth, and she was finally home. Did you love this jaw-dropping twist of fate? True heroes never need to brag. Their actions speak volumes when the unthinkable happens. If Major Bowman's incredible transition from mocked nurse to elite Black Ops surgeon gave you chills, smash that like button. Share this story to remind people never to judge a book by its cover, and subscribe for more heart-stopping real-life drama delivered right to your feed.